What is up, guys? This is Giuseppe Improta for Light Dark Academy, and in this episode we are talking about exposure. In this multi-part episode, I will explain what exposure is, how does it work in photography and cinematography, and finally how can we apply all that to 3D computer-generated images. To start with, let's try to understand what's the problem of exposing correctly and where did it come from. The problem started when the photographers wanted to capture on film what we are seeing, and in order to have a proper amount of light that is somehow corresponding to what's out there, we needed to measure this light in a way that the camera could understand. The media that are used to capture this light and hence create the images that we are used to are not as efficient as our eyes are, and they do not replicate 100% what we see and all the phenomenon that happens. So that means that we have a problem, which is how do we take all this data, all this information that our eyes through our brain perceives, and we shrink it into a smaller amount of data and we put it onto the film or the sensor or whatever it is that we are trying to translate our vision into. So exposing is nothing else than choosing a media onto which we want to capture our vision and fitting into this media the largest amount of information possible. So imagine that the amount of data that you want to capture is made of books and you want to fit this book in a bookshelf. Now imagine that our eyes is basically a very big bookshelf that fits a lot of books. Unfortunately, there is nothing currently available that can fit as many books, or there is no media available today that can fit an amount of data comparable to what our eyes can capture. So that's the concept that you have to think of. Like if I pick a digital camera, this digital camera can only save an amount of information that is limited by the technology with which it's built. All this to say that our eyes capture a lot of information, a lot more than any digital camera or film can capture today. So then, if the camera cannot capture everything that we see, how do we make sure that the image that we are capturing is coherent with what we see? Well, first of all, the image that we capture is never gonna be exactly the same as our eyes, for the reason that we have explained. But in general, we can get very close, and what matters here is the perception of that image. Our brain elaborates that image and makes all sorts of connections. Capturing an image as usually an artistic target is not something that we are doing just to make sure that the image is exactly the same as our eye. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any creativity in that. So how do we actually expose an image correctly? What are the parameters that we can use to make sure that the bookshelf is not too short and we can fit all the data that we need into that? In other words, how do we make sure to capture the largest amount of data that a camera can capture or a film can capture? Well, first of all, you have to define how many books you can put in the shelf. So what is the range that this camera can capture? That's exactly what the dynamic range is. The amount of books that you can put in this bookshelf is the amount of values that the camera can capture. Now let's assume that each book has a unique value that can be from 0 to 100, so from black to white. The amount of books that we can place between that starting value of 0 to the end value of 100 is the dynamic range of the device. And each device can have a different dynamic range based on the specs of the sensor and the technology that is behind it. When we look at the scenes outside or around us, there are scenes where there is very bright environments or other scenes where it's very dark. If you are outside in a plain sunny day with a very clear sky, you will have a very bright scene with a lot of light striking onto the objects. Whereas if you are in a cave where the sunlight just comes from a little spot on the top of the cave, everything around will be very dark. So how do we let the camera recognize if we are in a dark environment or in a bright environment? How does the camera know how much light it needs to capture in order to get that scene as we see it? And this is the key, as we see it. In order to create a reference system that makes sense between the cameras and our eyes, how we perceive and we see, the scientists made a lot of measurement and came up with a number set today at about 18%. So this 18% or 0.18 value gives us what is called the middle gray. But where is this 18% coming from? Why 18% and not, for example, 25%? The light that strikes the objects outside comes from the sun, and each object reflects and absorbs a different amount of light. And it was observed by measurement that the snow is the object that reflects the most light when we are outside, and that's an equivalent of 90% of light reflected, or something around that amount according to how dense the snow is, how fresh, and so on. And the object that reflects the less amount of light is when something is burned at about 3–4%. So once you have these two values, they represent the situation where the light is mostly reflected onto your eyes and is reflected to your eyes in very minimal amount. So once you do the average of these two values, and for average is not the arithmetic average but is the geometric means, which is a different way of calculating an average, you get to a value of 18%. Now, it's really important that we have this 18% value as a standard, as a reference point to all our capturing devices, because our human eyes don't actually see the same way across individuals. Everybody has a slight difference, and so what for me could be a middle gray, for you could not be, could be darker or too bright. And this is where this midpoint, mid-reference point helps, because this way is a measured value, and even though this value is not 100% accurate because it's made of a range of measurements, it's still pretty good starting point for everything that is related to capturing the light. So now that we know where this 18% comes from and why it's been decided to use that, now we can assume that this 18% becomes our standard, and our camera's instrument to measure the light, that is called the light meter, is actually based on these measurements. So it's a sort of a starting point that the instrument gives you to give you an idea of where you are with the amount of light that is hitting that media compared to an average 18%. I don't want to get too much into photographic and cinematographic exposure in this episode, that's something for the next video, but what you need to understand is that every measurement that the camera does is related to this middle gray. So let's recap what you've learned in this episode. The cameras that we use to capture images refer to an 18% values in their internal light meters that is used to measure the amount of light that is hitting the sensor or the film. This value is used to give you, through the light meter, useful information about how much light you are letting through the lens and onto the sensor or onto the film. And according to how the cameras are built, and we will see this in the next episode, you can manually adjust how the light is entering into the camera, and so modulate and change how the final image will look like. So this is what exposure is: fitting the largest amount of data that the camera is capable of recording. So I hope this was helpful and has given you an idea of what exposing is. In the next 2 episodes we will see exactly how to expose with a camera or a cinema camera, and how to measure our exposure and how to make sure that it's correct. And in the last episode we will see how these notions work into our computer graphics scenes. So that's it for today, and if you like this video, subscribe to this channel, share it with your friends, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.